Amen. So we're just gonna tackle this almost more like how I would structure a sermon. We're gonna kind of go verse by verse and pick it apart. Before we do, I want to give a little context, and if you have your outline, really there's just kind of three questions. I've been trying to do this a little bit, like what are we trying to learn? So the three questions is, who is Joshua? Sometimes we just assume that everybody knows these characters, and it turns out even as I read through some of these things, and I see I've read it multiple times, I realize I don't think I knew that about Joshua, even though I've read it multiple times. So there's always something for us to learn. So we want to know tonight, who is Joshua? Where does he fit in the big story of the Bible? What's he all about? I think that's going to give us kind of one layer of depth into chapter 1, verse 9. The second question is, what does Joshua 1:9 mean in its context? So if you're kind of new to studying the Bible, if we want to know what verse 9 means, we probably want to know at least what verse 8 and 10 mean. But then we want to kind of expand the story and see, where does this fit? What is this speaking to the people it was written to? And then once we figure that out, we can ask, what does it mean for us? So that's the third question. What should we take from a very ancient, old story in the Old Testament of the Bible? What can we take from it for 2023 where we would walk out of here not just thinking like, wow, I know this book of the Bible, Joshua, a little bit better, but I know who I am in Christ better, and I know what I'm called to be and what I'm called to do better. So those are our goals tonight. Sound good? Okay, so we're going to kind of breeze through this first part, but I just want to set the stage because it turns out that Joshua chapter 1 is not the first time that we hear about Joshua. So if you're not familiar with Joshua, here's kind of the context of Joshua. All the way back in Exodus 17 is the first time I'm aware of that Joshua shows up, and he shows up pretty much out of nowhere. It just basically says that there is a battle to be fought, and Moses looks around, and out of nowhere we just are introduced to this guy that Moses says, hey, Joshua, I want you to pick some soldiers, and I want you to go out and fight this battle. And it turns out Joshua does it well, and he wins the battle. And so the first thing we know about him is he has some military experience. So he's not just like some priest or a prophet in the old school sense. He's a guy who knows the military, and he's commanded the military to victory. So that's the first thing we should know about him. The second thing we know about him is all of a sudden, the Bible just starts referring to Joshua as Moses' assistant. We don't know why Moses chose him. We don't know any of his background. We just know his name is Joshua, son of Nun, which is a funny name, son of N-U-N. Lots of innuendo and funny things we could say about that, but we're not going to say that. Nobody? Come on. Son of a nun? We're Protestants, not Catholics. We can laugh about these things. Okay, so he starts to be referred to as Joshua's assistant. Now, one of the coolest stories in the Bible as far as Joshua is concerned, we just did this long series on Exodus on Sunday mornings. Do you remember that? So there's this episode where Moses goes up on the mountain to interact and have this intimate connection with God. He gets the 10 Commandments up there, and we find out that there's one person that kind of makes half the trek with him, and it is Joshua. And so how the story is set up, it's really strange, is all the Israelites are down below and they're doing some crazy stuff. And the Bible is not really clear if Joshua just hangs out in limbo in the middle ground or if he goes down. But it leaves you wondering, is Joshua maybe not complicit in all of that? He and Moses are clearly set apart in some way. And so Joshua is a faithful, good assistant. And all the way back in Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 1, God basically tells Moses that there is a time coming and it will be Joshua that is going to lead the people into the promised land. So there's a handful of things here, and we could go into depth, but this is not the point of tonight. Then there comes a time where it's time to transition from Moses to Joshua, and the Bible is very clear. There's two anointings or two commissionings that happen. One from Moses to Joshua. So the Bible is clear that Joshua has Moses' blessing to take over kind of the mantle of leadership. And then God himself speaks over Joshua. Actually, I think we should revisit one thing. Where's the eraser? So there's an episode that happens in the book of Numbers. And it answers the question of why is Moses not the guy to lead the people into the promised land? So there's kind of two big things happening at once. Number one, the people wander in the desert for 40 years. You all remember that? Why do they wander in the desert for 40 years? What's that? Yeah, lack of faith. So the picture of these people in the desert is like, we're so hungry, and then God gives them food, and they're like, but we don't want that kind of food. Oh, we're going to starve to death. And then he's like, here's manna, and they're like, oh, what is it? We don't even like this stuff, right? And then they're like, why are we out here? We would rather get killed as slaves in Egypt after they were grumbling in Egypt. So these people have lack of faith, and they're going to wander in the desert for 40 years. But while wandering in the desert for 40 years, something happens in the book of Numbers that seals Moses' fate as not the guy who gets to lead them into the promised land. What happens? Yes, exactly. I think there's a footnote, just so we get it exactly right. Yep, Numbers 32. So basically what happens, these people are super thirsty because they're wandering around in the desert, and God says to Moses, call all the people together and speak to the rock, and water will come from the rock. On the same page? The idea is that God is going to bring forth the water from the rock, and the people are going to drink, and their thirst will be alleviated. Moses gets so frustrated and upset by these people that instead of speaking to the rock, he takes his staff, and he basically yells at them, and he hits the rock. And what happens? Water comes from the rock. But in Numbers 32, God says, listen, that is not what I commanded you to do. I'm still faithful to provide water for my thirsty people, but that is not what you were commanded to do. You were not commanded to lash out in anger and frustration at the people. And so because of that, you do not get to lead them into the promised land. And so there's an episode at the end of Exodus, and I think it's in Deuteronomy as well. It might actually just be in Deuteronomy, where Moses climbs up on the mountain and God shows him the promised land with his eyes, but he never gets to step foot in it. A couple more things about Joshua that we need to know. Joshua in many ways lives... Yeah?
Pastor Andy, I just actually heard something cool on the podcast. Moses got to go into the promised land when he was transfigured, or in the transfiguration.
Oh, dang, I never thought of that.
I just heard it this week.
You know what you should have done? You should have said, I was just thinking deeply in an armchair for 6 hours and I came up with this. Everybody hear what Victoria said? I never thought of that. So Moses did go into the promised land. It was during the transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain. Oh, very cool. Very interesting. Okay, so Moses sees into the promised land. The last few things is right off the bat in the book of Joshua, some parallels begin to be drawn, and it's Joshua basically living out the same life as Moses. So I put 5 things that happen just in the first 5 chapters of Joshua. Joshua clearly has a connection with Yahweh, the God of Israel, that the rest of the people don't have. So right off the bat, we find out that he has an intimate connection with God. In Joshua chapter 2, he sends spies into the land, just like Moses had once done. He leads people across or through the waters. If you don't know, we're not going to cover it today, but I would highly recommend you read the first few chapters of Joshua. In chapter 3, they cross over the Jordan River, and they do it with the priests holding the Ark of the Covenant, and as they step into the water, what happens? The water of the river parts. And we often think of the Red Sea, and we forget that God parts the waters of the Jordan River. Bonus trivia question, God parts the rivers, as far as I know, one other time. Anybody know when that was? Dang, Elisha. He even said it with the SH and not the J. You're good, Pat. What happens then?
He strikes it with his mantle.
Yeah, he strikes it with is it a coat or his mantle? And so God splits the waters. So that happens for Joshua. So the people clearly have heard the story of Moses and the Red Sea, and now they're thinking this guy is a continuation of Moses. In Joshua chapter 5, all of the new generation that's born in the desert Joshua pauses and has them all circumcised as people who are going to bear the mark of the covenant. And then again in Joshua chapter 5, he oversees the Passover meal, the first one that ever happens in the Promised Land. So this is who Joshua is. Tonight we are going to go through the first chapter of Joshua verse by verse, and I guess the only question is, are we ready? I have had a handful of Krista's cookies and I'm feeling the sugar. I feel like I drank espresso or something. I'm a little jittery. Good thing what I'm about to say is God's word and not my own, or else I'd just forget it. So verse 1 says this: After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. So this idea of Moses' death is kind of a warning. I would say the first thing about Moses' death as a warning is that there is a commitment to obedience to the covenant and to the law. That even Moses is not above the law of God or the command of God. And so there is something for Joshua to be reminded right off the bat in the first few verses that Moses is dead and he didn't enter the promised land. God is not in the business in the Old Testament of doing people a favor because they were the leader. He commands obedience, and it doesn't matter if you're Joe Schmo and we don't know who your name is, or you're Moses, the leader of the people. So he says you're going to enter into the promised land. Now, I think the second thing as Joshua opens is, if we're going to kind of get in the headspace of these people, we have to remember who Moses was to them. So who was Moses? If you had to make like a modern comparison or a historical comparison, who is Moses to the Jews? Yeah, he basically gave them, God gave Moses, but Moses gave them the law, which basically governs everything about them, right? Governs everything. I'll just do an arrow. The law governs everything. Who else is he? Yeah, he's a founding father for sure. If there was a Jewish Mount Rushmore somewhere, he would definitely be on it. His status is cemented up there. What else? He's definitely a deliverer. And I think we all know, like I know for sure, Peggy, you know, like he's not a deliverer in their eyes like he did it, but he's the one who's leading them and hearing from God, right? So he's the deliverer. Have you noticed that throughout history there's always these legends of leaders who lead people across bodies of water? George Washington, who does he lead? Where does he lead? The Delaware, right? So he's kind of like a George Washington figure. He establishes something that never existed before, right? They revolt against a power that is trying to hold them back, and he establishes a new form of government. He's kind of a huge figurehead for them, right? He also kind of holds to an ideal and value. For Moses, it's the law, it's the Torah, it's obedience to God that's beyond himself. So for instance, I always, as a kid, was kind of marveled at the fact that George Washington had the idea of, like, you shouldn't let me be the president for super long. Like, he saw beyond himself. So this is who he is, and now he's gone. And so what is kind of the temperament or the feeling in the tribes of Israel? Somber? Maybe grieving a little bit. Moses is dead. What are we gonna do? Uncertainty. Yeah, definitely uncertainty. He's led us all the way to this river that is like on the other side of that is what we've been waiting for 400 plus years since God promised this land to Abraham. Right? So they've been waiting 400 years, and now they're on the precipice. They're on the edge of the promise, and the guy who's been leading them through everything difficult is now gone. And so now we have Joshua. And Joshua is told, get up. It's time to go. You're crossing the river. What an amazing moment to be alive. So this idea of we're going to cross the river is we're going to walk into the promise that God has had for 400 years. Now, I think this is just a pause and discuss for a second. How many of you feel like you have had things that God has told you, maybe a promise in your life or a prayer that you've been waiting for a long time? Oh, nobody. Nobody, really? Anybody been praying for something for a long time and it hasn't happened yet? Anybody been praying for 400 years? This is not supposed to be depressing. This is supposed to be uplifting. Here's the idea, is that God is faithful to his promises, even when the timing doesn't always make sense to us. These people are living out, and they're going to cross the river. The second they set foot on the other side of the river, they have walked into the promise that God gave Abraham 400 plus years earlier. Is that amazing? For context, the place that we live, the country we know as the United States of America, is not even close to 400 years old. Isn't that crazy? That's a wild thing to consider. Let's clear the whiteboard, and then we'll keep going. I'm still waiting to hear from Adelphia when they find out I steal their whiteboard every week. Hasn't happened yet. I repent of my stealing. The last thing I think is God says this. He says this in verse 2. He says, arise, go over this Jordan and all this people into the land that I am giving them. Let's talk about the land really quick, because the land, this came up a couple weeks ago. The land is a big deal, and the land is going to have some issues with it. But whose land is this? It's God's land. And this is important, because I think if we think of the land as God's land, then really what we're talking about is who are the more or less the tenants of the land. So who's occupying the land before the Israelites go into it? The Canaanites are, there's a lot of A's involved here, so I'm just going to, like when you're not sure how to spell something, you make it a joke. If you're watching on YouTube, this is because I don't know how to spell Canaanites. So there's people already living in this land. Now, if we forget that it's God's land, and we even make the mistake of saying this is the Israelites' land, then we start talking about all these battles and these wars, and we get maybe a mixed up theology about what is the land all about. But really at the core, the Bible would say that this land belongs to the Israelites. These people are living in land that they don't have permission to live in, more or less. And we don't have time to go into all the battles and all the blood because it's very violent, and Joshua brings up some big questions. But that is the paradigm that these people are living in. That land belongs to God, and he promised it to us. And it turns out, we're going to read this in a second, as long as they trust that God is leading them as kind of the military king, and they're not taking it upon themselves, they are going to win land. Every time they make the mistake of thinking, we are going to train our military and our fighting men, and we're going to go out and we're going to beat them, it doesn't matter when all the odds are in their favor, they are going to lose. When they act like this is our land, we're going to go get it, they lose. When they act like this is God's land and he's gifting it to us and it's ours to receive, they win. So that's a good kind of way to think of it. So they're going to cross the Jordan. One last thing that I think is pretty cool. Do you remember at the very beginning of the Gospels, Jesus goes out into the wilderness and he meets his cousin John the Baptist. And what is he doing? Okay, so they're doing baptisms in the Jordan. And I think sometimes we think of this and we think, oh, that's cool. They're doing baptisms in a river. How many of you would have liked to have been baptized in a river if you had the chance? Pretty cool idea. Is it an accident that he's doing it in the Jordan? Probably not. Yeah, probably not is a good answer. That's I'm not sure why, but it seems like you're insinuating. So it's not an accident, not an accident. What is happening with John the Baptist baptizing in the Jordan? They leave kind of the centers of population and they go out into the wilderness, to the place that the people crossed out of the wilderness and into the promised land. And part of the baptism experience is kind of this rebirth where now you get to re-enter the promised land as the person God desires you to be to inhabit this place. Does that make sense? And so when they go out there, they're not just going to have this spiritual experience. They're going to like physically walk out to the wilderness and re-enter as a new type of person. This is very interesting. Okay, every place, this is verse 3. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you. Do you notice the tense there? I have given. I've already given it to you, just as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea toward the going down of the sun shall be your territory. Okay, so I told you I upped my game. If you flip to the very back of your outline, there is a map. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is a colorful map. There is yellow, black, white, and red.
And the spelling of Canaan.
Oh, it even has the spelling of Canaan. Dang, I should have known that.
You just add I to.
I'm not going to lie, I was really caught up. Is there two A's in the first chunk of A's or the second chunk of A's, you know? Okay, so what you're looking at is a map of the Promised Land. And you can see all those really light gray lines are what will become the land that belongs to each of the 12 tribes. And the two arrows are pointing to two places we're about to read about. The first arrow at the bottom right there is pointing to Shittim. I cannot not smile saying that, I'm not going to lie. This is, we're going to find out where these people are located right here in Joshua chapter 1. This is where a physical, historical people group is camped out. Where that yellow star is just a guess because we don't really know, but we know that they are going from that place, and they're heading towards Jericho, which is on the other side of, you see the little squiggly line connecting the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee? That is the Jordan River. Somewhere in there is where they cross over the sea. So they're standing in this place, an elevated place, and they're looking out to the west, and God is saying, everything that you see is going to be your land. So now all of a sudden it's not just for Moses to see. So all the people who have heard grandma and grandpa, mom and dad, everybody talking about the promise, they come up and they're looking out, and what do they see? They see what has been promised to them for generations. I think we got to try our best to capture this if we're going to understand Joshua chapter 1, verse 9 in its real context. So these people are on the edge of walking into something totally unknown, totally exciting, nerve-wracking, dangerous, risky, rewarding, all of the above. They're looking at it. And what God says is, every place that the sole of your foot will tread, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses, from the wilderness and this Lebanon as far as the great river. I was reading a commentary this week, and this is what somebody said. They said, from this point, there's no way that they can see Lebanon. Number one, it's too far away. Even if it wasn't too far away, it's too hilly, they can't see. So what God is telling them is there are things even beyond your wildest dreams, all that you can see. You remember that scene in the greatest animated movie ever made? How many of you would agree? Matt gave me a half vote. Half vote out of 25, I'll take it. Everything the light touches is your kingdom. Am I like walking alone as the only millennial in the room? Did you guys not watch 90s Disney movies?
Probably watched it more with your children.
I don't want to let my kid watch Disney. Sorry, Disney. I cancel you back. Everything the light touches is your kingdom. It's Mufasa. He's sitting up on the stone. He's looking out with Simba, and he's saying, Simba, everything you can see, you're going to inherit as your kingdom. That's kind of the scene here, except God is saying, even beyond all the beauty and the marvel that you see and all the things you're feeling, there's even more than that. There's even more than that. I want to promise you land that you can't even see yet. These people haven't seen Lebanon. What do we know biblically about Lebanon? Cedars. Right? It's this picture of like an untapped resource of great timber and beauty. It's this rugged, beautiful place. Even that will be for you, he says. to Joshua. Verse 5, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. By the way, what does this mean? What does it mean? Every place the sole of your foot will tread upon, I'll give to you. No man shall be able to stand before you. What do these things mean? Yeah, they're promises, but what do they mean? What does it mean that no man will stand before you? Does it mean like you're not allowed to walk up to Joshua and talk to him? It means that you're going to be a conqueror, right? Now it turns out, this is why we read the Bible in context, because if we've only read this far, we're under the impression that Joshua is a total superhero and he can't do anything wrong, and everywhere he treads, he's going to win. All the land will belong to him. Nobody will be able to fight against him. He'll just slaughter them all, right? But God has some contingencies, and we're going to read it in just a second. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Verse 6, you can underline this. You ready? Be strong and courageous. We're going to hear it actually 4 times tonight. Be strong and courageous. When we get to verse 9, we're going to kind of dive deeper and talk about what these words mean. But for the time being, be strong and courageous. For you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give to them. Okay, strong and courageous. Why is it important that God tells Joshua to be strong and courageous in this moment? Okay? New land. You know what? Okay. So, he's a new leader. Anybody ever had like a promotion at work where all of a sudden you're in charge of a whole bunch of people? And that first day, what does that feel like? Am I up for it? Will they respect me? Will they trust me? How long will I last? All these things go through our mind, right? So he's a new leader. Peggy said there's real enemies. So we haven't talked about that yet. But part of looking out on that beautiful land is also seeing the settlements of some people who already live there. And they're not going to be too excited about a group of, we don't totally know, but definitely in the hundreds of thousands of people saying, hey, you actually got to move. We want to live here now, right? So there's very real enemies. What else?
Didn't the spies say that there were giants there?
Giants in the land? I think that was back when Moses sent spies. These spies are, just to connect the dots because we won't have time to talk about it, these spies go into Jericho and they meet Rahab the prostitute. So this is the connection of that story. Okay, so there's real enemies. These people have also been following Moses, so there's got to be some comparison going on, right? How many of you would like to fill the shoes of the guy who's got to go after Moses? No. There's like a thing that people say in sports that when like a star player retires, you don't want to be the guy who replaces him. You want to be the guy who replaces the guy who had to replace him. You don't want to be that next guy. So there's comparison. There's definitely fear of all kinds, right? So be strong and courageous. You're standing on the edge of something. And I was thinking about this week, and I thought of something else that I think maybe we can bring into our own lives and relate to. These people have been wandering around in the desert for 40 years, right? They've been eating manna in the desert. How many of you love to go camping? How many of you love to go camping for 40 years? I think it was Jim Gaffigan, the comedian. He had this joke where he was like, my wife was like, we should go camping. It's a tradition in my family. And I looked at her and said, if you go back far enough, camping is a tradition in everyone's family. Which, you got to laugh. It's not my joke. It's his joke. But they've been in the desert for 40 years. This is not comfortable. This is not easy. But I think psychologically we know something. If you've been doing something for 40 years, what happens in your mind, in your brain? How do you live your life? 40 years of doing the same thing. What happens to you? It's what we do. There's a level of, I'm going to write comfort. I don't mean like feather bed and pillow and air conditioning. What I mean, there is something comfortable about knowing what your routine is, right? How many of you are routine people? I'm like a major routine person. You throw me off my routine once or twice in the same week, and I got to sit down and reevaluate life a little bit. Okay, so these people have been doing the same thing. How many of you like eating the exact same meal every single day? No? But how many of you, Greg was like, what is the meal, Greg? Oh, steak and eggs. Yeah, I could eat steak and eggs every day too. What kind of steak, actually? Before I commit. Oh, sign me up. Sign me up. So even though they're wandering in the desert, I want us to see this. Even though they're wandering in the desert, there's something comfortable about it because it's their routine. And all of a sudden, crossing over this Jordan River, we're going to find out in a second, Joshua is going to tell all the people, you need to gather your supplies. And we find out that this is the last of the manna. You're about to enter into the land flowing with milk and honey. Now, milk and honey, you guys had milk? You had honey? It doesn't just magically show up like manna, does it? What do you have to do for it? You got to work. And working the land and the livestock is different than wandering the desert and setting up your tent. So these people have grown comfortable. They have routines. And now all of a sudden they're going to be introduced, even though they've been complaining and whining about it all along, there's something that's familiar. And now they're going to be disoriented. They're going to be in a new landscape, a new land. The promises for them are beautiful, but also is going to require a tremendous amount of work and trust in God that they haven't had to have. And so what God tells Joshua is, look, if you're going to be the leader, be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. To walk into something that's disorienting, maybe feels a little chaotic, feels brand new, the first thing God says is strength and courage. And we're going to find out that he's not saying dig deep and get it from yourself. There's a place where you can get strength and courage. The last thing I wrote down here is this. I think in a situation where we're going from comfort to chaos, I think that fear is a real temptation. And fear, I think kind of like when it builds up and pressurizes in us, it comes out in all kinds of ways. How does fear come out of adult people? I guess some people like just cower in a corner and cry and they're just, I'm afraid, but that's usually not the response. How do adults respond when they're afraid? Okay, immobilized, yeah. Avoidant, right? I'm afraid of X, Y, or Z, and so I'm just going to totally avoid it. Any avoiders? Any conflict avoiders? We're fearful of conflict. We're fearful of something new, and so we just avoid, right? He might watch this, but if he does, I'll apologize to him. Actually, it won't matter because he's basically deaf, and he's my paternal grandpa. He grew up very, very poor, basically the son of sharecroppers in Arkansas, Missouri. And so once he had some means, the idea of flying on an airplane was like, that's crazy. I would never go on an airplane. Anybody want to guess how many times he's flown on an airplane? 0. In fact, the reason I'm even bringing it up, my mom just told me you got to pray because we don't know what to do. He's totally deaf. He can't hear a thing, and he's insisting he's driving from Missouri to California to come see us this summer. Why? Could he just get on an airplane? Fear is a real temptation, right? And it can grip people. And so I think it's something that we need to think about. When God gives us a promise, how many of you are excited about walking into a new season or a promise? From a distance. Hey, you're in Egypt. You're slaves in Egypt. There's a promised land for you. It's waiting for you. How many of you love that? I love that. Then you wander in the desert for 40 years, and now it's time to walk into the promise, and might get sketchy, might get dangerous. I'm not flying, I'm going to drive, right? That's what happens. Verse 7. Only be strong and very courageous. This is verse 7. This is the second time. And where does this strength and this courage come from? Being careful to do according to all the law that Moses, my servant, commanded you. So where does it come from? Obedience. Strength and courage. God is not telling Joshua, you're the leader. You got to dig deep. He's saying, you want to be strong and courageous? Obey the law. This is the Torah, the first 5 books, right? Joshua, if you stick to my word, and what's in that word, by the way? We're going to examine some of it. What's in the Torah? What's in there? The Ten Commandments. What else is in the law? Are there stories in there? Are there stories of people encountering really sketchy, scary things? Yeah. They know the Moses story. How about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob? Remember all those characters we did? What about Noah? If you stick to this, Joshua, you will find the strength and the courage you need to cross the Jordan and lead these people. You will read stories about Noah, who was told, you're a total moron. What are you doing building a boat in the middle of the desert, right? You'll hear stories of Abraham being called to sacrifice his son and saying, I don't get it, but obedience over my gut. You're going to read these stories and they're going to empower you. So if you're taking notes, I think to be strong and courageous, one of the things that we have to do is we have to know God's story. It's hard to think, how on earth could God get me out of this when we don't know God? But when you run into a tough situation, you think, how on earth is God going to get me out of this? I'm not 100% sure, but I know that God got Noah out of his situation. And I know that God delivered X, Y, and Z, all these people that we can read about throughout the scripture. I love this. He says in verse 8, he says, do not turn from it to the right or the left. This is just a phrase that means stick right to it, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth. So it's not just read it, it's bring it with you. Speak it out loud, pray it. It's on your mouth. But you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Total side note, just kind of an interesting side note, because I was curious what the word meditate meant, because sometimes we read these words and we think, oh, in the wrong context, that word can mean some funky things in our culture, can't it? So if I told you, hey, you should go home and meditate, the first thing I think a lot of you would do is like, number one, no. Number two, it's weird coming from you, right? But it's in God's word, so I wanted to know what it meant. This is a long way of saying I don't even know exactly why it means this. I just looked it up and thought it was curious. This is the fifth footnote in my outline. The idea of meditation is actually, it's a sound that's starting to come, but isn't fully out yet. The Bible has two examples. I put them in there. One of them is a dove. That's almost like doing like a throaty like warning call before a hunter comes for it. And the second one is a lion that's like doing that super low-pitched, like low-volume growl before it roars. So the idea of the meditate on God's word is have it like already halfway out. Nobody else thinks that's cool? I think that's cool. It's like so part of you that it's already halfway out of your mouth at all times. I clearly thought that was cooler than you guys do. And it says this, it's that if you do all according to what is written in the law, then you will make your way prosperous and you will have good success. Okay, if there was ever a landmine of a scripture to walk into without its context, it's this. So, let's just play a little game here. If you do what is in the law, you will be prosperous and have great success. That's what verse 8 says. What would be a very poor interpretation of verse 8? So we'll just call it out of context. If you do what God's word says, you're going to be prosperous and...
Be a millionaire.
What's that?
Be a millionaire.
Yeah, a millionaire, so money, money, money.
That's nothing to this day, huh?
Be a millionaire. Oh, cool. You might be able to afford one home in Orange County. What's that?
Said I couldn't afford my own house now.
Yeah. Okay, so out of context, this means if I just do what God says, I'm going to be wealthy and successful, and anything I want I'm going to get, right? God, I want a yellow Ferrari. Whatever I got to do, I'll get there. Do you know that you can go on YouTube, you can buy a DVD set? There are people who will teach you this for some money, right? Televangelism is rife with this kind of thing. Money, success, promotions, right? If you're interested, I could track it down. It might not be totally appropriate, but I saw this late night host. I think he's gone now. It's a British guy. Basically, he followed a Christian kind of televangelist of the prosperity gospel, and he was just like, I just want to see what happens. So he sent him a few bucks, and he talks about like the 40 correspondence back and forth and how much money he ends up sending out to get the blessing or whatever it is. It's terrifying stuff. This is what happens when we just read verse 8. If we only knew verses 1 through 8 and we had a little bit of context, what does this verse mean? What would you say it means? If you do the law, if you meditate on it, you have it on your lips, and do all that is according to all that is written in it, then your way will be prosperous and successful. First of all, who is God speaking to? Joshua. What is right in front of Joshua? Is it a yellow Lamborghini? Is it $1 million? No. So what is success and what is prospering for Joshua? Promised land, right? You will enter the promised land. You will lead these people well, right? You will walk upright with integrity and character, and you won't be brought down. You will succeed in the battles I've called you to. You see how this works? You see how grabbing a verse out of context could get you in a lot of trouble really quick? We have to remember this is written to Joshua. This is a quote that I pulled out of a commentary I really liked this week. It says this: "No, God is not a heavenly vending machine dispensing health and wealth to the faithful." So he's saying, God is not just all about giving you whatever you want, but we must not miss the truth that our best hope of experiencing the goodness of God's creation is by living according to God's eternal law. So this is what the guy's saying. You don't approach God as the eternal vending machine to get what you want, the prosperity and all those sorts of things, but there are blessings that God gives to those who are faithful to his word. It's a side effect. It's not the primary effect. It's not why we do it, but we are definitely blessed based on following what God says we should do. Okay, are we ready for verse 9? I kind of went back and forth on how to do verse 9 because we're going to read past it. So what we're going to do is we're going to pause for a bit on verse 9. We're going to dive in, I would say, like 80% of the way. Then we're going to finish the rest of chapter 1, and then we're going to finish kind of the chunk of verse 9. Does that make sense? My fear was last week, I looked up at the time and couldn't believe that 90 minutes had already gone by, so we don't want to do that again. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. It's very interesting. You can underline that. This is not a suggestion, is it? This is a command. Now, there's a big difference between a suggestion and a command. Think about this for a second. If the tone of this was, hey, Joshua, I know that you're a little nervous about leading. One piece of advice I have that you might want to follow is be strong and courageous. It'll go well with you. That's different than, I have commanded you. When God commands you to do something, what is at stake? What's that, Ricardo? Everything. If God commands you to do something and you don't do it, what are you guilty of? Disobedience. It's not like, I'm going to lay this advice here, and if you want to pick it up, cool. If not, do your thing. When it's a command, for Joshua not to be strong and courageous is to disobey God. What happened to Joshua's predecessor when he disobeyed God? He didn't get to go to the promised land. So there's a lot at stake, and Joshua knows what's at stake. So this is a command. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed. Some versions say, do not be frightened and do not be discouraged. I think that's actually maybe a better word as I crack my voice. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. I think the first thing, if we're going to really pick this apart, is this verse is spoken to who? To Joshua. Okay. So if we're going to figure out what does this mean for Andy in 2024, 2023, it's for me now. I'm not waiting until 2024. So it's to Joshua. So before we really want to interpret a verse and we want to say, like, what does it mean to me? How do I apply it to me? First, we got to figure out what did it mean in its original context to Joshua. So I think this is what's going on here. To lead these people well is going to require strength and courage. We're all in agreement of that. And why would God command that? It's because we've already talked about it. A human instinct in this situation is to react in fear. Okay, so we got that part. That is a human default, by the way. Do you guys know the concept? It's like rooted deeply in our biology. It's fight or flight. And how does fight or flight work? Yeah, there's something that happens in us even before we can analyze or interpret a full situation and get the hang of it and figure out what's going on, is if we see something and we have so much fear, our reaction is, and we don't fully know why, it's either fight or flight. But either way, this is fear, right? If Joshua reacts like this, in his fear, fight, what's going to happen? Death and losing. Because we're going to find out that when they fight on their own behalf, they always lose. When they fight in the way that God tells them to fight, they always win. How many of you are going to the Gideon Bible Study? How does Gideon's army play out? Remember that? It just gets whittled and whittled and whittled. And what's the whole point of the story? When they win, can they take credit for their own victory? No, because their victory is so ridiculous and so over-the-top dumb on its face that the only thing that could have possibly happened is God did it. So if Joshua chooses to fight or flight, he's going to be disobedient. So God says, you cannot react in fear. I want my word to be on your lips. I want you to be strong and courageous. It's a command. So Joshua is the leader of these people. And his job is to set a tone, an example for the standard of how God's people are to live and act in the land. So I think there's 4 commands here, and I want to just break them down. And I want to break them down with the lens of what we just read, that Joshua is to have God's word on his lips. He's to live it and incorporate it into his life at all times. So in order to be strong and courageous, there's something about, in the Old Testament, it's the Torah. I'm just going to say God's word. And I have a few examples that I think will make this kind of ring true to us. So be strong. To be strong, biblically speaking, if you're taking notes, is that you trust in the strength of God and not your own strength. How many of you are very strong? No, just kidding. Yeah, I work out once or twice a year. So I lift kids up and down into a crib a lot, and so if you weigh 20 pounds or less, I got a pretty good strength for this motion. So here's the idea. To be strong and courageous, first is to be strong, is to trust in God's strength. And how are you going to trust in God's strength? You are going to be close to his word. Here's an example for you. When you know God's word, you know that God was strong enough to get you out of Egypt. Remember that? So if I trust in God's strength, how strong is he? He can miraculously overpower the superpower of the time, Pharaoh and all of Egypt, in a miraculous way. Does that breathe life and confidence into you? Okay, we're going into battle against 10,000 men. God got us out of Egypt. If God got us out of Egypt, this is going to be no problem for God, right? Be strong. Be courageous. By definition, to be courageous means to be bold in a difficult circumstance. To be bold in a difficult circumstance. When you know God's word and you're thinking, be bold, be faithful, obedient to God, even when it doesn't make sense, you would know that God commanded Noah to start building even while everyone thought it was the dumbest thing they had ever seen, and he did it. So if God is asking us to cross a river, and I can remember Noah built an ark for decades, or how long was it? We learned it. I can't remember off the top of my head. 100 years. Built and built and built, right? I can be bold. The third command is the first one that is flipped over into the negative. So the first 2 are be strong and be courageous. The third one is do not be afraid, or do not be frightened. This is interesting. This word means to be moved to trembling or caught in awe of something like in a negative way. So this would be like coming up over a mountain and looking at the military below you and being so in awe of how powerful they are that we could never, ever beat them. This is not in God's word that the people in Joshua would have known because it happened after. But how about this? There is a military called the Philistines, and they are the most powerful military. Not only are they the most powerful, they have the singular most powerful warrior. Remember him? His name is Goliath. So if you knew God's word, and God's word said not to be afraid, don't get caught in trembling over the things you see with your eyes, you would know that God called a boy with no armor and no military experience to put a rock in a piece of leather and overtake the entire army of the Philistines, right? Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. This word means to be shattered or broken. In other places that I found this word in the Old Testament, I think it's the idea of anticipating defeat before it even happens. So you're anticipating we're going to lose before you've even fought the battle. So God says, don't do that. Don't be discouraged. It's the idea of looking around and feeling hopeless, like nothing is ever going to get better. If you knew God's word and you were Joshua's contemporary, you would know this story, that there was a boy named Joseph who got beat up and thrown into a well and then sold into slavery. Would that have been a moment to be discouraged? But how did God bring Joseph through? In fact, he set the stage for those people to come out of Egypt in the first place, right? And so you would know this. So do not be discouraged. I just wrote some notes for myself. These are just 4 things that I thought of. To be strong and courageous requires these 4 things to me. Not an exhaustive list, there's probably more. The first thing I think I would like to do in my own life is recognize the limitations of your own strength and courage. How many of you see an obstacle in front of you and you just start analyzing how you're going to tackle it? And when you're that type of person, you get a lot of things done, right? But is there a temptation to start looking at every single instance in your life and think, how can I defeat this or overcome it on my own strength and my own power? Is there? And I think sometimes if you're like me and you get into that cycle, like how am I going to defeat this? How am I going to tackle this? How am I going to solve this? We come into situations that are too difficult for us, and then we start believing things like, oh, I stink. I could never do that. I'm not strong enough. I'm not good enough. But if we start to grow in our ability to say, God is strong enough to do all things, and we pause and say, God, I'm pretty sure I could do this on my own, but I want to ask you, is there another way you would have me do it? If we start to be those people, then we come to the big, huge things, like, for instance, the walls of Jericho, and we don't think, oh man, how are we going to break down those walls? We think, God, this is your land, you're giving it to us, those people are living in it. You got any creative ideas? Do you remember what God does? Throw a worship concert and just start walking around the thing, right? And they're like, well, we don't know how that is going to play out with swords and clubs and spears, but we'll just do that, right? They become people who recognize their own limitations. The second thing is I want to call to mind the character of God, not just the character of God, but the stories that I know of the Bible more often. That was something that I wrote down. Do I often look at a situation in the world, and is my first response, I wonder what Bible story connects deeply to what's going on in the world? Or do I jump to politics or warfare or history to understand something? Or do I see there's a story awfully similar in the Bible, and this is how God acted that out? The third thing is just to pray simply that, God, would you remind me that you're with me? You notice what Joshua was told? Be very strong and very courageous. I won't leave you, and I won't forsake you. It's a promise of God's presence. It's a promise of God's presence. And the fourth thing is that when the time comes, you got to walk in it and you got to cross the Jordan. When the time comes and God says go, it's not, I'm not sure I heard that clearly, God, are you sure? I feel like sometimes God's saying it's a 2-letter word. It's not hard to understand. I said G-O, go. Go. Walk in it and go. To be bold and walk in it. We're going to circle back to a couple more things, I think, for verse 9. Oh, there's one big question. Okay, so this is a command to Joshua. So here's my question. If it's a command, a promise to an individual guy in the book of Joshua, is it a promise for you? Maybe we could theologically talk it out. Is it? How many of you would say, yes, tentatively, I think so? I would say, I would not choose Joshua 1:9 if I didn't think it was for you. Because, man, wouldn't that be like the biggest letdown? Surprise, what a great surprise and blessing for Joshua. It's not for you. I don't know what to tell you. Class dismissed. This is what I would say, because I think sometimes we can get in trouble. We can get in trouble taking a verse that is, a promise for the Israelites or for an individual, and then without any depth of thinking, we can just say, oh, that's for me, I receive it for myself, without thinking, like, what does it mean? This is what I would say, some things to consider. Throughout the Old Testament, the people, have you noticed, they don't directly follow God. They do it through an intermediary, usually a priest or a prophet or a king. Does that make sense? Okay, so they follow God, and God gives his instructions through a prophet. Oh, that's not going to work because both start with PR. Prophet, priest, or a king. And oftentimes it's a combination of all of them, right? But are common people regularly, as far as the Old Testament tells us, just hearing from God and doing their own thing? No. They're getting instructions. Moses got the 10 Commandments. Here it is, right? Jeremiah, which we learned a few weeks ago, has a warning from God. Here's the warning from God, and I'm giving it to you. Everybody on the same page? Okay, so this is how the Old Testament is set up. Why is the Old Testament set up that way? Why does God lead his people that way? Yeah. Yeah, because Easter hadn't happened yet, right? Okay, so there's this, and then there's this event right here called Easter, and all sorts of crazy things start happening. For instance, the curtain that separates God and people is torn in half. What is that symbolizing? Access. Okay, so after Easter, everyone now has access. You can come into the presence of God, and instead of being terrified that you're going to drop dead, remember the story where the guys accidentally grabbed the Ark of the Covenant because they're like, oh no, it's going to fall over. We don't want it to fall over. They touch it, and what do? Dead. Right? Remember when they tied a rope around the ankle of the high priest, like, go in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur and sacrifice for all of our sins. And if you die, we'll yank you out by the ankle. Why? Come into the presence of God sinful, dead. Right? There's a reason that the vibe, to use modern parlance, is Moses, the number one guy of all of God. Sorry, you hit the rock instead of speaking to it. Don't get to go to the promised land. Why? Because in the Old Testament, God cannot tolerate sin. In the New Testament, can God tolerate sin? No, he still can't, except as Matt's word, there is a bridge that has been built, and it is called the resurrection of Jesus, right? In Jesus, who has access to God? Everyone directly, right? The Bible says that we can come boldly into the presence of God, which is ridiculous if you're Jewish and you don't believe in Jesus. To come boldly into the presence of God might be the stupidest thing any Jew could ever do, right? But because of the resurrection of Jesus, we can. So, who has access to God now? All of us. Okay, so we all have access to God. We are all in some way responsible for leading something, even if what we're leading is just our own personal responsibility to be faithful and obedient to God. Does that make sense? We are all in the midst of crossing over obstacles, spiritually speaking, that God is calling us from one place to another place. And when we do that, I would say that in Jesus, we're not following the leadership of a prophet, a priest, or a king. We are following the leadership of Jesus, of God. And as humans, our natural response to difficult things is fear. And so, I think this is 100% for us. Not just crossing the Jordan River, but if our natural reaction bodily is going to be fear to difficult things, I think God's word of be strong and courageous as a command is for you and it's for me. So that is important ground to cover. Just out of curiosity, and we could talk about this a little bit more, but if somebody came to you and said, well, I understand that God said that to Joshua, but he didn't say it to you, how many of you would be comfortable giving some version of this answer? You would feel like, I think I got the hang of that. Because I don't know if you know this, but this is one of the conflicts that people have with God's word, It's you Christians, you're reading an ancient document that was written to Joshua. Why are you reading it like it belongs in your life? You know, people say these sorts of things. This is very easy. I think the easy answer for a lot of the Old Testament stuff, what does it have to do with you? If you're thinking, sheesh, what does it have to do with me? Easter, that is the bridge. That's almost always the answer. That in the resurrection of Jesus, all things directly to God are for me. Okay, verse 10. And so Joshua commanded the officers of the people, pass through the midst of the camp and command the people, prepare your provisions. One commentator I was reading this week said it's very interesting. They're about to cross over the Jordan, and we're going to find out very quickly they're going to wage war with Jericho. And they get together and they don't say, prepare your weapons. They say, prepare your provisions. This person was saying this is a kind of a foreshadowing of who is going to do the fighting. God is going to initiate the fighting. The people are going to have to fight, clearly, but they're not going to initiate the fight. God is going to tell them, and he will initiate the fight. So they're to prepare their provisions. The other reason they're supposed to prepare their provisions is because the second they cross into the promised land, guess what they don't get anymore? Manna. You better collect what you got, because once you're on the other side in the promised land, part of the promise is you're going to get back to work. A land flowing with milk and honey. By the way, we got time. What's the deal with milk and honey? Yeah. Milk and honey are like secondary blessings, right? In order to get milk, you have to have healthy, strong cows, right? You got to have grazing land, you got to have nutrition, they got to have water. In order to raise cattle, you have to have some relative peace. You can't just be at war with people, because guess what in the ancient world people often did? If they were going to wage war, they usually did what? Burn their field down and kill their livestock. At the very least, if this war goes on for a while, at least they'll starve to death. It's kind of what happened to Jericho. They're like, we don't know what to do. Let's just lock ourselves in, right? Maybe others in the ancient world would have said, oh, they locked themselves in. Let's just starve them out for 3 weeks. God says, nah, let's not starve them out. Let's have a worship concert, and we'll defeat them through our worship. Okay, so milk, honey, these are like secondary beautiful blessings. They're sweet, good things. But honey is only made when bees have flowers, and you have time to keep them. Kind of cool. So the idea is that you're going to be there. There's going to be peace and prosperity in the land. You're going to have all the things you need, not just to have cows and beautiful flowers, but the things that come with them, these blessings. So Joshua says to the officers, pass through the camp and command the people to get their provisions. For within 3 days you are to pass over this Jordan to go to take the possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. So here is the command. It's been 400 years in the making, and we just read it. 400 years, Jewish people for generations have been waiting to hear these words. And Joshua says, and sometime in the next 3 days, we're crossing. Your feet will stand on the promise that Abraham had. How cool is that? That's cool stuff. Verse 12. And to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, Joshua said, remember the word that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, saying, the Lord your God is providing you a place of rest. You should underline that, the place of rest. And will give you this land. The idea of rest is, this is like the Hebrew language for perfection. This is God created and then he rested. For the Jews, this is language of security, it's safety, it's peace. Can you rest when there is a violent military knocking on your door? No. So the idea is peace. It's prosperity enough where you can have milk and honey. You can raise your kids up with laughter, and you can project into the future because you have time to think about these things. He says he's providing a place of rest and will give you this land. This is a little historical, so let's just bear with me here, and then I'll do my best to explain this. Your wives, your little ones, and all your livestock shall remain in the land that Moses gave you beyond the Jordan. But all the men of valor among you shall pass over armed before your brothers and shall help them until the Lord gives rest to your brothers as he has to you. and they also take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving them. Then you shall return to the land of your possession, and you shall possess it. I'm glad I'm not trying to write the word possess, because that's a lot of S's. The land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you beyond the Jordan towards the sunrise. Okay, so here's what's going on. If you flip over to your map for a second. By the way, everything I'm about to tell you was very shaky up here. If I say this with confidence, it's because it's fresh. I learned this in the last week or so. So if you look at this map, do you see the Jordan River? Okay, there are tribal lands. You see Manasseh, Gad or God, and Reuben. See those? Those tribal lands are east of the Jordan River. So if you're looking where they're crossing the river, those tribes already have their land. You see that? So technically speaking, they could say, what do we need to enter the battle for? We already got our land, right? Why should we submit ourselves, our kids, our wives, to the fear of going to fight a battle when our lands are on this side of the Jordan River? What's interesting is, I was reading this week, in some sense, some of these people were already standing in the promised land and they didn't know it yet. Isn't that interesting? So they're standing literally in one of the tribal lands and they don't know it. Kind of fascinating. But this is what God says to Joshua. He says, listen, I'm going to give you the land and it will be your place of rest. Then he says, all the people who belong to the tribes that are already on their side of the river, you are going to leave your children and your wives behind. You're going to get all your military stuff. You're going to be armed, it says. And you're going to go with your brothers and you shall help them. And then verse 15 says more or less this. Until the Lord gives rest to your brothers as he has to you. So pretty much, you all are going to now be acting as a unified, singular body of people. You do not get to live into your rest until your brothers and sisters have their rest on the other side. So this is a team effort until everyone has their land, nobody has it. Does that make sense? They will have to fight unified, and we know because we've read through the Bible before. Do they stay unified? No. Unfortunately, they don't. And they answered Joshua, verse 16, all that you have commanded us, we will do. And wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your commandment and disobeys your words, whatever you command him shall be put to death. Only be strong and... So who's telling Joshua to be strong and courageous now? All the military men are saying, we'll follow you. We'll follow you. We'll listen to you. So much so, if you command it and someone doesn't do it, I think they should be put to death. We will follow you just like Moses. And then they give him the same command as God has given them. If you're going to lead us and lead us well, we need you to be strong and courageous. Is that cool or what? I think Joshua chapter 1, it kind of operates as the full passing of the torch of Moses to Joshua. That not only has God anointed Joshua, but now the people have accepted Joshua as their leader. Yeah?
I want to ask, I keep staring at the map. Does, if I'm pronouncing it right, Ephraim have any importance here?
In what way?
To like when they stepped in and crossed the Jordan, because that's Hebrew for to be fruitful, and that was fulfilling the ultimate promise of Abraham.
Yeah.
Asking what's the importance of that name, or the naming, because I like that name.
Yeah, the name is important, and I think it will become more important. But they cross over and they go into Benjamin is where Jericho is that right? Well, I guess I could look. Yeah, Benjamin. Actually, they win the fight in Jericho, and then the very next thing they do is they get super proud of themselves, and they decide, we're really good at fighting. Let's go attack AI. You don't want to attack AI these days, do you? But they go and they attack AI, and they lose really badly, even though they're outnumbering them significantly. And it's like their first lesson in what will become Benjamin's land. That, hey, you can defeat Jericho by the power of God, this mighty place, and you could lose to a little podunk town like AI when you try to do it on your own. So I think Ephraim comes in much later. Okay, here are some of the takeaways that I have to wrap us up tonight. I was thinking about this idea, and I think it's pure at this point in the Old Testament, because Joshua is their leader, but Joshua is is kind of an interesting figure, and Moses is as well, because are they prophets in the sense that you think of a prophet? Not really. Later on, they're kind of referred to that way. Are they kings? Are they priests? So what are they? They're leaders, but they're kind of embodiments of what God wants. They're basically in every single way just pointing people, they're listening to God, and this is what we're going to do, right? And so this is pre-king Israel. There's no such thing as a king yet. You notice that? And there's something really beautiful, and we see it really quickly if you keep reading Joshua. I would encourage you. When they act as though Joshua is their king, guess what happens? Bad. When they operate as though God is the king, what happens? Good. So much so where God says, you don't need a king. Remember that in Samuel? What do you need a king for? They're like begging for it. You don't need a king. You don't need a king. And so I was thinking, what does a king do in the ancient world? And I wrote some things that I know about kings in the ancient world. Kings declare decrees. They give you meaning. They give you purpose, values. This is what we value. We're Jericho, right? This is what we value. We're Romans. They give you direction for your life. That might be good or bad. You might be destined to farm celery for the rest of your life. Bummer. That's what you were told, right? And so I was thinking, this is what kings do. Kings sit on a throne and they basically direct all parts of your life. Do we have modern kings? Maybe not in the sense of like a Roman emperor, but do we have things that give us meaning, purpose, values, direction? Do we? I think it's not a stretch to say that the Bible would say that you have a throne and it's in your heart. And part of cooperation with God is giving him permission to sit in it. How many of you are really good at that? All the time. How many of you are working on it? How many of you say, I'm stumbling, but I'm stumbling in the right direction? Yeah, that's me. How many of you would say, I am guilty of sometimes catching myself thinking like, even without knowing it, I let something else sit on the throne of my heart and give me meaning and purpose and direction and values? Anybody have this temptation? Happens to me. I don't watch a lot of news, but I like to read the news. And sometimes I read enough news that I step back and think like, whoa, my whole understanding of the world just got shaped by the 10 articles I just read. There are people writing news that are sitting on the throne of my heart directing what I value right now. Anybody else feel like that's a temptation sometimes? And so I think that this is, whether it's Joshua and ancient people crossing the Jordan River or it's us, it's that there are lots of kings that can sit on the throne of our life. And they are the things that give us purpose, meaning, values, direction. They tell us if we're worth it or we're not worth anything. And anything but God on those thrones is leading you in a direction that's not godly. I think some of the greatest temptations and some of the worst things that we can do is put Christian things or Christian people on the throne of our heart because we feel like we're going in the right direction. I heard Danny say this not that long ago. He basically said, like, I don't want you to follow me. I want you to follow God with me. And I feel like that's the message, right? Because if you were to put Danny on the throne of your heart, would you get closer to Jesus? Maybe in some ways, but not in the way that God intended, right? And so I think the first thing we have to notice from this story is that human leadership, Joshua in this story, his job is to point you to God. His job is when you come to him, he already has God's word coming out of his mouth. Does that make sense? It's oozing out of him so that you are not tempted to follow him. You're tempted to follow God because God is like enticing. You're curious. How does he do that? How is he such a strong leader? How is he strong and courageous? Not my strength, not my courage, it's God's. And I get it from God's word. The second thing I get from this story is this, is that God is glorified when we are fully dependent on him. There's a reason that Gideon's story is in there, right? Is it totally possible that stories throughout the Bible could have just been left out? We learned from John last week, right? What did John say? I got so many stories, I could fill up volumes. I could fill up a library. That Gideon story is in there. And it's telling us that when we're fully dependent on God, when we are like, God, I will lead the army of 300 people who are a little off and got some screws loose up top and they drink water out of a stream like a bunch of dogs, I'll lead those guys into battle. What do you have in mind, right? It's because God is glorified when we're fully dependent on him. Not when we go into battle and think like, God, when my human strength runs out, do you think you could get my back? Right? Or, God, you could wait here. I got it from here. I'll come back if I need something. God is glorified when we are fully dependent on him. This is a difficult thing for us, I think especially us, because we live in literally the most affluent place and time in the history of humankind. Right here, right now, we're probably living in one of the epicenters in all of human history. And so it's very difficult for people like us who have been told a story that you are self-dependent. If you just work hard enough, you're going to make it. And it's all about me, and working hard and upward mobility. I'm not saying those things are bad. I'm saying when that is the narrative that you've taught yourself over and over and over and over, and then someone's like, you need to be fully dependent on God, but you've been fully dependent on you for a long time, and it seems like things are going well, it's pretty tempting to say, hey, God, I'm going to bench you, and in the fourth quarter, if the game's close, I'll ask you to come back into the game, right? It's a temptation that we have. So God is glorified when we're fully dependent on him. One of the other things I wrote down here is that fear is a human reality. How many of you know that you will be fearful? It is going to happen. When God says, be strong and courageous, I don't think he's saying, don't be fearful. You're not allowed to feel that. I think what God is saying is this, is that you can experience fear. You can't control getting fearful, but you can control what you do with it when you get it. And I would say what we do with it is we submit it to him. We remember we're not walking forward in our own strength and our own courage. We're doing it in his. So God, I am terrified right now. I'm not sure the way out. But in this moment, I'm recalling the things that I know you've done. Whether it's from my own life or it's from your word that I know you can get me out of this. I want to depend on your strength and your courage and not my own. And then I think this is the end. I think the end goal for Joshua, and I think the end goal for all of us when we're fully dependent on him, is that we would come into the rest that God has for us. And I would say in Jesus, we're going to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus on Easter. That rest is not a promise that we have to wait for. It's a promise we can have because of him, even in the midst of all the chaos. That we can look at the world and say, like, you know what? My hope and my security are already locked in. I don't know how I'm getting from point A to point Z, but I know I'm getting there. I don't know what B, C, D, E, F, G, and all the other points along the way look at like, but I know where I'm ending up. That I have eternal rest, I have eternal peace. It's not a future promise. It's already locked in. It's going to happen, right? And so I can live as though I'm already there because I am. I already belong to him. I am his. That's who I am. That's my identity. This is a quote from the same guy I quoted earlier. This is where we can end. This is the ultimate rest, to be fully reconciled to God, freed from the guilt and power of sin, and to be fully reconciled to our neighbor, ourselves, and the natural world. This is what he's saying. He's saying because of what Jesus has done, we can live with our neighbors, ourselves, the world around us, exactly how God intended right here and right now. So God, thank you for your word. And as we turn our attention and we start thinking through the rest of the week, we call to mind your word, and we call to mind what your word tells us about the sacrifice that you made. God, thank you for bearing the burden of all sin. God, thank you for going the entire distance all the way to death, even death on a cross. And God, thank you as the light dawns on Easter Sunday, we're already anticipating it, that tomb was empty. And that in conquering death, you have invited us to live the life of freedom that you always intended for us. And so, God, we walk out of here today. I pray that you would remind us to walk humbly, that we can never, ever do it on our own strength, in our own courage, but it's only by your strength and your courage of what you have done. So God, thank you for marking the path for us to be obedient, Thank you for your word that calls to mind all the ways that you've been faithful for generations. And God, your character doesn't change. You've been faithful forever, and you will continue to be faithful. So we invite you into our lives in even greater measure than ever tonight. We pray that you would go before us and remind us of your presence. Amen. Amen. Joshua 1:9. There you have it.